one, and live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Glasgow 2024 presents The Media of Storytelling, Print versus Screen. Warm welcome to people who are coming to us from Eventbrite and for those watching on YouTube. Just some quick things before we get going properly. Firstly, this event is subject to the Glasgow 2024 Code of Conduct, which is available on our website, glasgow2024.org. We have a zero tolerance policy on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc. Anyone behaving inappropriately will be removed, one strike, and you're out. On a happier note, for webinar attendees, questions can go in the Q&A, and you can chat with fellow attendees in the chat. So if you have questions for the panelists, we'll get to those towards the end of the panel, but feel free to put them in the Q&A as we go forward. And if you are on YouTube, you can add your questions in. We'll have your question relayed into the Zoom by our very capable tech person, Pam, who is amazing. If you are live Xing, live tweeting, live tooting, live skying, or live anything elsing, you can use the hashtag Glasgow 2024, and then people can see that you're talking about the panel, and we can have a discussion. And then I will introduce myself and my lovely panelists. So, hello, I'm John Coxon. I'm the moderator for this panel. I am a podcast host, so I host a podcast called Octothorpe, which goes live every other week. And I will let my panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I write under my initials, which is AM Justice. I do not write Westerns, as you might think from that name, but instead I write science fiction and fantasy, and I have a science fantasy duology out that is called the Wyrn Saga, a Wizard's Forge, and a Wizard's Sacrifice. So I am thrilled to be a part of the panel and looking forward to the discussion.
Rob, we'll go to you.
My name is Rob Greene. I write as R.W.W. Greene because he's easier to Google. Next month, I've got this book coming out, Retrograde, which is a sequel to this book, which came out last year. And by day, I'm a college adjunct professor.
Fair enough. And then finally, Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Hanks. I'm the author of these two books. I write science fiction and fantasy, and I'm a freelance editor on the side.
Excellent stuff. Thank you all very much. So the focus of this panel is the differences in storytelling between the print and the screen. And the blurb kind of asks us to discuss the ups and downs of storytelling in different media. But I think given that kind of the three of you all authors, I think that the logical place to start is to ask each of you what you think the core strength of writing for the page is, and then we can kind of spin out from there. So I'll start in the same order. So I'll go with Amanda first. But Amanda, what do you think? Like, what do you think writing for the page? Like, what is the strength of that? Like, what does it do best?
I think what the page offers as an author and a reader is the ability to go deep and go wide. Because, you know, you may have, let's say, a standard traditional published novel, especially an early one in an author's career, is usually around 120,000 words. But it can get a lot larger. And it just basically gives you the ability to really be epic in your storytelling or go extremely deep into the introspection of the characters. And those things can be carried off on the screen, but I think as authors, we have a little bit more freedom and flexibility to either go wide or go deep in our own unique and special ways. So certainly for character introspection on the screen, that relies on the actor's ability to carry that off. And and the epic sense on the screen, it really depends on your director and your special effects crew. So as the author, you have the ability to, it's all on you to make those things work. And you certainly have the space in a novel to do it.
Yeah, no, okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. Rob, what do you view as the core strength of print?
One of the most important things to me is it's much cheaper for me to write a book than it is for me to put on a movie. I imagine to put Mercury on screen would cost several $1 million. And if in my head I want to cast Diego Luna as my main character, I can do that and I don't have to pay him a thing. But if I did it in real life, I'd probably have to pay him millions. So in terms of getting my story out there, I think, the printed word, the page is probably my most financially apt way to do things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's a lot cheaper to ask someone to imagine something than it is to show it to them, I guess. Dan, do you have any thoughts on what the sort of strength of print is?
I mean, I did, and then I went last. So these two answered everything I had. But I would say that voice is quite a huge strength of writing books, because I think on screen you can certainly have directors' styles and there are certain types of movies, but I think each person's writing is so individual, and the voice can be something spectacular, I think, on the page. And because Amanda's mentioned we can go more epic with it, or we can go really inside someone's head, it can make a lot of difference, that voice from each writer. So that's something I love about books.
I think that's a really, really great point, and I wish I had said it.
No, thank you. That is, that's insightful. And I will say, I will let you go first on this one, Dan. I'll go the other direction to make up.
Now he's not going to have the answer at all.
And now I'm expecting like a sparkling response here. So there's like no pressure, but some pressure.
I only came up with voice because they covered all my other points.
What do you think is the biggest weakness or difficulty with writing for the page?
Oh God, where do you want to start? I mean, I've got to be honest. I was going through the strength and weaknesses of these, and some work in both categories. I'm going to go pretty simple for me. I love music in movies, and I would love a soundtrack to books, which you can, I guess, get with audiobooks of some kind. But I do miss that sort of other dimension to it. You can get fully inside the head of the characters. You can experience these things. You can feel what they're feeling. I'd love some sound. So that's for me. Maybe it's not a weakness, other than for me personally.
No, I think it makes sense. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But Rob, what do you think the biggest weakness of the page is?
I'm trying to imagine a soundtrack for a book right now, and imagine would you have to slow it down as the reader reads slowly, if the reader reads slowly, or would you have to if there's an engaging Indiana Jones type intro, would it have to play at half speed as you get through? I mean, Dan, give me the answers here. I don't understand.
I just have the question. I don't have any answers.
Okay. All right. Okay. The weakness, I guess, I'll have to get back to you on that, because I tend to think that pretty much anything that film can do, words can do better, but maybe I'm biased. I think I'm biased, but that's okay. I'll be all right. I'm all right with being biased.
No, that's fair. I'm not expecting impartiality necessarily. So that works for me. Amanda, what do you view as the...
I am gonna pull the job interview thing and say the same answer that I think is a strength is also potentially a weakness with books, is that there's so much space that the author can digress and go off on tangents that don't end up contributing to the story or the forward momentum or character development, and sometimes are just superfluous. And a lot of this depends on the reader, because some readers love all that extra stuff. And if it's depending on the author and the series or what have you, sometimes I love all that extra stuff too. But a lot of times I just want to move things along, and the author is throwing in a whole bunch of characters that don't actually do anything important to the story, and I get frustrated and irritated with that. And I think that one of the things that the really good film adaptations and limited series adaptations of books, and I'm going to use Game of Thrones as an example, is streamlining the narrative so that it stays more on point. And when I say Game of Thrones, I'm going to say, let's just keep it to the first maybe 3-4 seasons. But anyway, I think that can be a flaw in books, is that they go too wide and too much stuff going on that isn't necessarily all that interesting or important. And I think sometimes authors can really indulge themselves and become too self-indulgent with their writing, and that's a weakness of the print medium.
Can I throw one in? I just stole from Dan.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I think in film it's much easier for the characters to cover up being dumb than it is in a book. Like I'm thinking about like a mystery or horror or something like that, because you can't see their inner life, you can't see what they see. So if they don't see the monster coming, it's more understandable because it's all just panoramic view as opposed to interior view. So you can have a pretty dumb detective who keeps missing the clues and you don't notice that as much on screen. Thanks, Dan.
No, that's a good point. I recently read a book which I very much enjoyed, but my wife very much didn't. And part of that was because the book was playing with unreliable narration. I think she got very frustrated that the main character, because it's written in the first person, but as the audience, you're working things out that the main character is not working out. And my wife found that incredibly frustrating. And I suspect in a movie that would have been much more palatable for her. So no, that's a good point. I think one of the things that becomes clear from your answer, Amanda, is that I think we're implicitly discussing novel length page writing.
Oh,
I guess.
I mean, that's a good point, because sometimes short story, short stories, you can't go wide and you've got to keep it succinct, and sometimes maybe that's why sometimes short stories make better movies, possibly, maybe, I don't know. There is an argument to be made there, but true. I'm losing my train of thought. So I did want to comment on Dan's point about soundtrack and music. And I know a lot of authors who listen to certain bands or certain albums while they're writing. And it certainly does give you the sense of sort of the soundtrack of your work when you do that. And it'd be nice if you could translate that somehow into the work. And it's very easy to do. It's probably easier to do if you're writing science fiction or horror or something contemporary, where you could make reference to the specific piece of music that you might have been listening to while you were writing. But if you're writing, say, epic fantasy that takes place on a secondary world, you can't say I was listening to Jethro Tull. Well, you could have like the Flautus danced upon the stage on one leg, but
well,
I don't know.
They had Ed Sheeran in Game of Thrones, so there's definitely precedent here. I think Yeah. Well, I guess that gets to the screen.
Yeah.
And coming back to the question of music, I know that Douglas Adams wrote Restaurant at the End of the Universe while listening to Procol Harum. So like one of the things I've often done is kind of have that low in the background. But I wanted to pick up on Rob's question as a result, like how given that everyone experiences books differently, like if you have an audience in front of a screen, they're all experiencing this at the same rate, right? Like they're all watching it and it's unfolding in the same time frame, but people read at different speeds. So how can you, is there a way of melding music to books in that way? Like has it been tried? I'm trying to think if
I can't think of any examples, but I would say that I'm probably not alone in being a writer who writes to music. And there are some cases where you are writing to a specific tune, soundtrack, whatever. And I think that infuses in the writing as you're writing it. So it's probably incredibly subtle when it comes out the other end. But I mean, I think that's probably the only way you can have a soundtrack to a book is through the writer's emotions as they're listening to the music and pouring it into the writing.
I imagine with technology today, you could try it. So you'd like turn the page and like, you know, a tune would come on that plays along, but then it would have to like stop when you get up to go to the bathroom or something like that. Or like you missed a section, you'd have to go back and reread it. The music would have to follow you back to that section or something like that. So I think it would be a really interesting experiment to give that a shot. It would probably be easier with ebooks, but there definitely could be something that, you know, like something that amps up the tension, even some kind of like subliminal subharmonic sound, like, you know, like the pipe organs that make you believe in God. You know, if you hear that as you're reading a horror passage, it would give you kind of a shiver. That would be an interesting thing to do.
I think there are some audiobooks that I'm not a huge audiobook person, but I'm pretty sure that I've like come across a few that do have kind of soundtrack aspects or little, at least snippets of music interspersed into the audiobook. I imagine though there's probably some production issues with that because you've got to pay for the music and or contract to use it and so forth. So
yeah, I listened to an audiobook of Peter Pan when I was a kid, and there was some music in that I will never, I mean, I can't remember what it is now, but I'll never forget the music and how it made me feel as I was listening to it, and it was kind of interspersed all the way through. So yeah, if someone out there can figure out how to do that with reading a book, that would be amazing. Thanks.
So no, and the Star Wars audiobooks have music from Star Wars, which, you know, obviously massively helps create the environment they're going for, and they feel much more Star Warsy than the paper books do. And I wonder whether what we're discovering is one of the intersections, or one of the ways in which you can make a book feel more cinematic, and that might be something that we can come back to a bit later. And I was going to pick up on, so Rob, you were talking about it being much cheaper to create scenes on the page than on the screen. And I think that kind of ties into what Amanda was saying about it being a lot easier to go off on tangents in a book. But I think it's also a lot easier, like you don't have to pay for the sets, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can have a new location in every scene and it's not going to make your producer yell at you. So kind of how does, when you're writing, do you have a sort of, are you trying to limit the number of locations to avoid your audience like getting confused, or is that just not really something you think about if you're writing like for the page?
Was that a question directed to me, or am I being a jerk?
Yeah. Good. I'll ask you first, and then I'll let.
I don't think I hop around quite a bit with the stuff that I write, because a lot of my work involves travel of some kind, of going place to place. The story moves with the travel. So I don't necessarily worry about that too much. Maybe I should, but that's kind of what my to me, it's like a short story. The kind of the rule of a short story is it should be in one place, limited number of characters, one major conflict, and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And if you don't want to bounce around too much in a short story, but in a novel, you have the space to move from space to space. And I think that's why I write more novels now than I do short stories.
That makes sense.
I think that, to me, I agree with that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that is something that there definitely is more freedom to explore more in sorry, my hair is doing weird things, to explore more in novels. However, I think that to some degree, series kind of solve that problem, like series television solves that problem too, because then that's, by definition, they're almost like going to new places every episode. So it can.
Well, and it was, I don't know if anyone watched Supergirl, but there was like a noticeable change in location between one season and another when the budget clearly was increased and the HQ got significantly nicer, which was very funny. But yes, no, it was good. So let's kind of tackle. We've talked about the page and print, and let's move on to screen. So I think that I basically have the same question, which is, what does screen let you do? What does writing for the screen let you do that you can't do on the page? And I'll ask Dan, and I'll do both at the same time this time. So like a strength and a weakness, Dan, of like, what do you think the big ones that occur to you are of writing for the screen?
I think when you're writing, you're very aware that the end product will be a collaboration of talents. So when you're writing a screenplay, you generally don't direct the actors with the dialogue unless it's something that is opposite to the actual dialogue itself, and you need them to say it sarcastically when it clearly isn't, or whatever. So I think there's one of the strengths is that when you're writing it, there are going to be other people, other talented artists coming in and delivering these lines, setting up these shots. I mean, one of the best parts about writing a screenplay is that when you get to the action bits, you can fluff it quite well. And as long as you could explain it quite clearly, it doesn't need to be poetic or anything like it might do when you're writing a book. You can just say, the car explodes, and someone will go off and figure out how to do that, how to make it look great. And coming back to the soundtrack, and I just think soundtracks are such an important part of movies. They can really lift them to a whole other dimension, like Star Wars, for example, which I think exists primarily because of the excellent score. And it's just, I think one of the strengths of film is that it is a collaboration of talents. It is the writing, it's the direction, it's the lighting, it's the acting, it's the music, which is brilliant. On the flip side, it is, the actual experience is kind of passive. You don't get to necessarily get inside people's heads on the screen. You're watching it from a distance. There's almost like there's a screen between you and what's happening. So, as opposed to what we talked about with the book, you can really get inside a character and really feel what they're going through and hear their thoughts. And you can't necessarily do that with a film.
No, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Rob, what's your thought on the strength and weakness of the screen?
One of the good things about screen is the accessibility. People who don't like to read can watch a movie. People who don't have time to read can watch a movie. 300 people can be sitting in a theater at the same time and have that communal experience, like we all cheered when Captain America picked up Thor's hammer. That's not going to happen, when, someone's reading a book by themselves. So I think, the visual can be much more communal than the printed page. I think that's probably one of the biggest strengths. And also, there's the money. If you sell a book, you get so much money. You sell movie gets made, and you get the right contract, you get so much more money, which is always nice. And I hate to keep talking about money, but there it is.
It makes a lot of sense. And what do you think the bigness or the big pitfall is, as it were?
I think the biggest is also the accessibility. I think about something like Natural Born Killers, which is a satire about, violence and how so many people thought it was encouraging violence. There almost should have been an IQ test before you're allowed to see that movie, or Fight Club or something like that. Like, a book is almost self-selecting. You're not going to pick up a book. You're not going to pick up Fight Club, unless you're going to read it and think about it. But you might go to the movie and just then start your own Fight Club, even though that's not what the movie's all about. So I think the accessibility is also one of its greatest weaknesses. Okay,
now that's an interesting point, and I'm going to come back to that. And Amanda, what do you think the key strength and weakness of Screen is?
I think, for me, as a writer who's never actually attempted to write a screenplay, but has always fantasized about doing it. I think that one of the intimidating factors for me to do it is the fact that you are so much more constrained in terms of how much storytelling you've got to do in a very, very limited amount of space. And that it's, you've really got to hit those high, the high points. I don't really know the technical term for it, but you've got to hit those marks in terms of engaging the audience and keeping them engaged, and you've got a lot more flexibility in the written word to do that. And I think with a film, it's important to really hook the audience and hold on to them. And I find that the idea of trying to do that in the space of a film script really intimidating. I think the other thing potentially that's a weakness, I'm only talking weaknesses here, but building on what Dan said, is that I can imagine that if you were a screenwriter and the collaborative aspect of it is awesome and amazing, but what if they do a crappy job? What if they take your script that you poured your heart into and then they ruin it? So it's like, and as I understand most screenwriting contracts, is that you don't have very much control. It's like you write it, you give it to the director, and the director takes it and it's theirs. They might come back to you for some rewrites, but they might get another writer to do the rewrites, and whatever you crafted is not necessarily what that end product is. And it might be better than what you did, or it might be worse. And that must be heartbreaking, if I think so.
Yeah.
But in terms of the strengths of film, I am one of those people that I watch way more than I read. And I love the visual experience. And I think Rob's point about the communal aspect of it, and there's nothing like, I was thrilled when we all started going back to movie theaters, and the communal aspect of going to a movie and sitting there and everybody, sharing that experience there's really kind of nothing like that in our world anymore, because we just don't, we don't interact with each other the same way that we used to. And live performance is usually, it can be prohibitively expensive to attend in many places. And I think that's what's wonderful about films.
Can I just?
I'm sorry, Dan. I apologize.
No, you go. Up to you.
No, because AM said something a little while ago about like so many short stories or maybe why short stories make better movies than novels do. And I was thinking about, all the strengths and weaknesses you guys are talking about. And I'm wondering if like graphic novels kind of hit that sweet middle ground. Soundtrack of course, but you've also got you've got the visual, you've got kind of the dialogue. You do have some introspection because you have the thought bubbles and this kind of stuff. And you do see a lot of like graphic novels / comic books being turned into movies as well. And I wonder if that's where the appeal is. I don't know. It was just a thought I had.
Is that because the director has already got a pre-made storyboard, so they can just
maybe
pull off of that? So.
Yeah, sorry, just coming back to something, Amanda, you said, just the collaboration aspect and how difficult it can be is what brought me back to writing, because I spent years, I wrote a novel and worked on it and queried and didn't really get too far with it. And then I started writing screenplays. And it seemed to be, I started working with a producer and it all got quite exciting. And then until the point at which I realized I've got this screenplay and now there are 100 people it has to go through before it gets anywhere close to being seen. And then I thought, in publishing, I write a book. If I write it well enough and it appeals to an agent, I've got an agent, and then they can, if they know an editor who it would appeal to, it could get a deal, and that's 2 people. And that made me realize, actually, writing a novel, as hard as it can be and as soul destroying as it can be, compared to getting a screenplay on the screen, it's not even close. And if I may, someone's dropped a question in the Q&A. It's from Scott, who is a film editor in his day job, and he's finishing his first action adventure novel. And one thing he's been warned about by writers and editors is that it doesn't work to fast cross-cut between different locations and vantage points, for example, in the giant battle on different fronts. And he hears it again and again, and do we have any thoughts on that? And I would just suggest that I know a lot of people like to start with action and think it's exciting, but unless you know the characters, I don't think it works. So I think cross-cutting between different characters and viewpoints is perfectly fine in a battle, as long as you know who they are. And so it should come probably a bit later in the story. And I was just wondering what you guys thought.
I totally agree. I read Scott's question and I was wondering who told him this, that you can't jump around in a battle to different characters and different viewpoints within a battle. And I completely agree with you that it's totally fine and it can be awesome. And I've read a lot of authors do it really, really well. But I think you have a good point, Dan, that you can't do it at the start of the book. You've got to do it at the point where everyone is already familiar with the characters and will, and cares about them. So you're not lost.
Yeah. But you also don't want to lose your footing. You want to make sure. I'm thinking about, if you think about like the film version of the Two Towers, the Tolkien thing, and you're cross-cutting from Gimli to Legolas sliding down the thing to Aragorn doing the thing. You've got to make sure that when you do that, you make sure in a book, you got to make sure that your reader immediately knows where their feet are, and what's happening, and maybe the distances and that kind of stuff. And that can be hard because you have to show how each phase of the battle or each place in the battle is different enough that I can understand on the page where they are.
I think that's a really good point, because because you're right, in the Two Towers there is so much, like you're here, you're with Legolas, you're with Gimli, you're with Aragorn, and you're jumping between them very quickly. But on a page, each character needs to like complete their journey through that battle, probably in 1 or 2 scenes, not, too much jumping around, like a couple of sentences for each character. Although, a really great writer, that's the thing, is that if you're good enough,
you can do anything.
You can do anything. Yeah. You can, the rules are meant to be broken, but you can only break them if you know what you're doing. So,
No, so
I'm thinking about Joe Abercrombie, who does the grimdark stuff. He does a good kind of fast cut battle scene to the point where I'm not exactly sure how he does it, but it seems to work okay.
So one of my co-hosts on my podcast, we read and discussed 6 Weeks Lafferty, which has a lot of it has a lot of changes in scenery, and she found it quite confusing because she didn't feel the different scenes were distinct enough that she had a sense of where she was in the book, and she found that very frustrating. And so I can see that, like, if you're, and I confess I didn't, I always knew where I was, but I think that is something you have to be very aware of, because I've seen readers kind of bounce off things because they feel like they don't know where they are. And actually I like the movie of the Two Towers, but I disliked it in writing because I found the jumping around so frustrating as a reader. I like the first book, I like the last book, and the middle bit is just the bit where everyone has to go from the end of the first one to the beginning of the third one. You just have to get it. But like, yeah, so I think that's definitely something, because a film is so much more, because it's so visual, you immediately know you've moved and you don't need someone to explain it to you. And that is one thing a film can do very well that a book can't, I think.
Yeah.
But it's a very good question, and it ties in really neatly. So thank you very much, Scott. That was very good. So, and I guess the question then I have is sort of, do you find, and I know that Amanda, you haven't written screenplays, but if you're writing a screenplay, do you find that the sorts of stories you want to tell are different because you have different strengths and weaknesses in the two media? Like, do you think like, oh, I've wanted to write this action story, but I'm going to save that for a more visual medium because I think it will be easier to tell? Or does that not really figure into how you think about these things? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
When I used to teach creative writing, I used to teach, I teach fiction, drama, and poetry, and drama included stage acting. So when I think about like I had to write plays to learn how to write plays, so I had to, so when you think about a play on the stage, you can't really do a space battle on stage unless you have people running around the stage pretending to shoot each other in little X-wing costumes or something, which would be kind of fun. But in terms of a novel versus a screenplay, especially today, I think you can pretty much do almost anything, unless it's some kind of like, the dream sequence or some kind of. I mean, I'm thinking about one of my favorite short stories is "Bullet in the Brain" by Tobias Wolff, and it's all about this. This film critic, this novel critic, literary critic, who goes to the bank and gets involved in a bank robbery, and he's so acerbic to the robbers that they shoot him. And a lot of the story takes place between the bullet hitting his forehead and exiting the back of his head, and it's all that's like going on in his head at that time. And I think you could do that in a film or a TV or video, but I think it would be kind of cheesy, you know what I mean? So if I were to write something like that, then if I wanted something that was kind of small and interior, for the most part, I think I'd want to write it in a novel. But if it's something that needs that bigger kind of spectacle, visual kind of reference, then I think I would write it for a screenplay. So when I've written screenplays, they've been mostly kind of bigger ideas, ideas that I needed people to be able to see things happening, and not so much because it's all very panoramic. It's a continuous art. So when you're writing a screenplay for a movie, people can't stop it in the middle and like go back, a couple of seconds to see what just happened because they forgot. Well, they can do that in a book. So if I'm going to go for a screenplay, I'm going to want to go with something that's a kind of a simpler idea too, I think, is where I'm going from.
Well, I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good point. Sorry, Dan.
That's all right. I was just going to say that I think you would think that certain stories lend themselves to certain mediums over others, but there are so many fantastic filmmakers out there and so many fantastic writers, and we've just said if you're good enough, you can do whatever. So, for example, I mean, I always go back to Matthew Riley, who's an Australian writer of sort of thrillers and action adventures, and his books are just like, it's like watching a movie, but you're reading the book. but you are watching the movie in your head as you're reading. And I
Mhm.
think there is a certain skill to that just you wouldn't think you'd be able to do it on the page, but he can. And I try and aspire to that one day. And I certainly found that you can. I mean, there are ways of doing it on the page, but similarly, if I had something very simplistic, sort of lots of internal narration, I think there are ways of doing it on the screen, and I'd be really excited to try and do that, and think about how an actor or a director might bring that out on the screen. Obviously, I'd be leaving it to other people to figure out, but I think I mean, there are so many talented artists out there that I think everything can be done.
Why do we still don't have a film version of Neuromancer though, Dan? Why? What about that film?
That might be the exception.
Book. Thinking about all those unfilmable books that sometimes when they're attempted, they probably should not have tried.
But then there are other books that, people thought were unfilmable, and then somebody goes and makes a great adaptation of them. And I think, again, it's just like, you just got to find like the right director with the right vision who can capture the gestalt of the book and knows what tweaks need to be made sometimes to make the story work. And so I would think, I think Cloud Atlas was considered to be a quote unquote unfilmable book. And then somebody went and made a great film adaptation of it. So, and that was really, really true to the book too. It not only captured the spirit of it, but actually captured the plot pretty well. So, I think that I don't know that. I think all these things just wait for the right person that comes along and has the right vision of it. This is outside the scope of science fiction and fantasy, but I'm currently on a kick of rereading all of Jane Austen's novels and also watching a lot of the movie adaptations. And one of my favorite adaptations is the adaptation of Persuasion with Dakota Johnson in it. So it's very, very recent. And one thing that adaptation has that the other adaptations don't have is it captured the sense of humor of that book, because the book is actually really humorous, but but most of the adaptations really focus on how, the main character is so sad because she's a spinster and oh boo-hoo. And this very recent adaptation with Dakota Johnson was just really captured sort of like this sort of indomitable spirit of the heroine, and how, there's an underpinning of joy and very strong sense of humor running through that book. So that is, to me, a great adaptation. A lot of people might not like it because it sort of updated the language, and it's very, kind of wry in that sense. And but I don't know. I think it's all about the spirit.
No,
anyway,
and I think that's the one. Sorry, I think the thing Cloud Atlas does really well is it captures it doesn't try and tell the story in the same way, but it does a good job of conveying the same plot and vibe.
Yes. And it was a brilliant decision to have the same actors play the character, different characters throughout the thing, which was sort of captured the idea of the re-souling of all of the different
and I don't know whether people think, but is that an example of being able to use the screen to draw parallels? Because in a book, if you had wanted to make it clear that the characters were related by having them played by having them look similar, you'd have to have really driven that point home with the descriptions, whereas in a movie you can do that very naturally. So are there other examples of adaptations of books where they've managed to convey the same vibe by using some of those advantages in different ways? Like, can anyone think of any
examples? Is anybody watching the new Foundation series on Apple?
My wife loves it, but I haven't watched it, I confess.
You haven't watched it?
We watched the first season. Haven't got to the second yet.
What do you? I mean, I think it's pretty amazing. I mean, I think Asimov would have loved it, even while realizing that they've taken many liberties and made his little series much more dynamic and interesting. But speaking of people, the same character, same actors being used. They took the spoilers. They took the genetic dynasty and turned them into clones, so they can have Lee Pace and the other empires, chewing the scenery over millennia of acting because they keep getting recloned, which is something that definitely used the visual to their advantage.
I love the emperor, the three emperors, and I love the fact that they are how they like sort of they all go through the same sort of progression of as a young man being very idealistic, and then the very cynical middle-aged man, and then the whatever old man. It's just I think it's great, and I also like how they adapted the way that Asimov wrote it. So
if you like the first season, you'll love the second season.
Okay, I had some issues with we had some issues with the first season, but definitely the second season it's coming up on our, we always have like a certain number of shows that we're watching at any given time, and we just haven't gotten to that one yet. So
I would I'd also throw in It as a book that was, it's a big book. It cuts back and forth between the younger kids and the adults. And obviously, that's pretty difficult to film. And I think I love the TV series, but or the limited series, but the recent two films where they split it between the kids and the mostly adults with the kids in, those movies conveyed the vibe of the book by doing it in a very different way. And the casting is immaculate with the kids. And I just love it so much, but it's because they completely redid it in terms of the structure, but because they took the vibe of that nostalgia and they cast it so well between the kids and their adult counterparts, I think it just works perfectly. And obviously,
did you see Boyhood with Ethan Hawke and how they actually filmed the kids when they were younger, and they started filming the film when they were like 2003 and finished in like 2014. So they were actually able to use the same growing up actors to play the same characters over 10 years. What was that? It's called Boyhood, but it's Ethan Hawke. So they.
It's Richard Linklater directed.
Yeah, Richard Linklater is the director.
Yeah, I've not seen that yet.
And it didn't win. I have thoughts on that, which would be fascinating project for sure. And that really is something you couldn't do on the page, right? Like that kind of thing is very definitely film specific. I wanted to touch on, so we talked about unfilmable books, Dan mentioned It, and we talked about Cloud Atlas and Foundation. I wonder whether, and the other one that comes to mind as a book that people thought was unfilmable was Dune. And I think Denis Villeneuve is trying his best to prove everyone wrong. But I wonder whether two things are making books easier to film, which is firstly, studios are more willing to let you do a two-parter, which I think helps a lot. In the case of like It and Dune, like they both need to be two parts, but also you now have this thing where you have these kind of prestige series where you can have sort of episodes, but it doesn't feel like the inferior thing to a movie. It feels like it's just as valid. So do you think it's becoming easier to film books as we expand what the screen can be? I'll start with you, Rob, because you made a noise.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this conversation I was having about the Marvel books, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and how you've got films and you've got these miniseries, and how some of the miniseries or actually seem to be episodic, and some of them seem to be a movie cut into chunks in terms of like, where the highs and lows and this kind of stuff are. And, sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work so well. When you think of like, Moon Knight might have been better as a movie than it was, a 12 episode miniseries, because they had to stretch the material so much that, there was a lot of filler, or, there's other things like that, it maybe if they should have made different choices about, what to turn into a movie and what to turn into, which is interesting considering that, the base of this are monthly comic books. But I guess the short answer to your question is yeah. I mean, I think it's expanded what you can do. I mean, we still haven't seen Neuromancer even as a miniseries, but we have seen Peripheral, which is another Gibson book that no one thought was going to be filmable. Even be able to do like a half-hour episode and a 45-minute episode and an hour-long episode. And not have anybody bat an eye about the change also allows them to make an episode shorter without having to pad it, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it is way more flexible now, isn't it?
Yeah, you don't have to worry about commercial breaks and tailoring your episodic televisions. Again, the highs and lows of it to when the commercials have to be fit in. So and especially when they have to be fit in at specific times, like first commercial break at 15 minutes, second commercial break at 20 minutes, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think as a viewer that my certainly enjoyment of episodic television and movies that are based on books has increased enormously. I think that the investment in these properties has really, really helped. I mean, when I was a kid, and the only fantasy, especially fantasy, science fiction, I think fantasy is lagged behind science fiction in terms of studios' investment in making it, for lack of a better word, good. It was just terrible, and it took years and years and years before the people started making actually really reliably good fantasy movies and especially television shows. Fantasy television was just terrible until probably Game of Thrones really was the first really, really good fantasy where it was serious, where the actors were good, where it wasn't, because it was so previously there was such a reliance on like, oh, it's magic and people will just watch it because there's magic in it or something like that. And it's like, no.
I have a good friend who would kill me if I didn't come to the defense of Xena Warrior Princess at this stage.
You know what?
So
I
have to.
But I will say I loved Xena. I loved it. It was probably one of my favorite shows in the 90s, but I also considered it a guilty pleasure. So I couldn't just love it independently and openly. I had to be sort of secretive about the fact that I watched it, and that I would be annoyed when I'm there. I had this friend who would always used to call me like right when it was on, and I'm like, why are you calling me? But I could never admit to her that I was busy watching this.
No, that is reasonable.
Yeah, and there certainly were other shows. I will say Xena was a better show than Hercules. I watched both at the time, and Xena was far and away. The writers of Xena really sort of started to take off into really cool and interesting places and thought-provoking in a way that the Hercules kind of show kind of stayed a kid's show. And it wasn't really done as well. And the urban fantasies like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff, those were great. in the 90s, but like the sort of medieval or historical stuff wasn't really great until.
Could I throw in the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon?
You can absolutely do that. Please,
which
please
I
elaborate.
thought was amazing and needed an end.
Yeah. I was going to throw in the Linda Hamilton and Ron Perlman Beauty and the Beast in the subways. That's my fantasy.
I remember watching that. Ron Perlman riding around on the tops of subway trains.
So one thing I want to, so you mentioned it needing an end, Dan, and one of the things I guess, is it easier to bring long stories to a close when you're writing in print versus at the whims of a network or as a movie studio, like, or are they just different problems?
I think they'd probably be different problems. I think if you're forced into ending something, you're going to find ways to tie it up as best you can, as quickly as you can. And with a book, it's a very solo process. So you're going to be consistently doubting every decision you make in your head. You have more control over everything, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So I'd struggle.
I'd just jump in and say, I think with books, here's where that expansiveness can serve you well. Because if you think about the end of Lord of the Rings, and I mean, everybody loves the end of Lord of the Rings in the book. And at least in my family, I'm the only one who's actually read Lord of the Rings. So everyone else has just watched it. And I know my husband finds it very frustrating in the film version that it's like, it's not over yet. You know, it's like they have the wedding and a lot of people who haven't read the books think, okay, well, that's where it should end but no, they go back to the Shire and then they hang out and, Sam gets together with Rosie and that's nice and and then finally, they go to the Grey Havens and take off for Valinor. And I know that a lot of people who haven't read the books and don't know the whole world building and what the really meaning of that departure from Middle Earth actually really is, they're just like frustrated with this sort of like 45-minute coda to the whole story that so, and I think that's hard to pull off. I think that Peter Jackson needed to include all of that in the film for the fans, but people would have just like rioted if it had ended at with the wedding, for instance. But
I want to ask two questions on what you just said, which is firstly, I guess that underscores something I don't think we've said explicitly, which is, and I don't know whether the panel agrees, so maybe I should ask instead of just asserting it as fact. But do you think that books let you play? I would argue that a movie has to be a relatively traditional kind of 3 or 4 act structure for audiences to go along with it and find it palatable, unless you've got like an art cinema crowd in. Whereas a book can be much more free form with how it structures its story. Do people think that's a reasonable assertion on my part, or am I going mad?
I think that's the accessibility thing, that's one of the reasons it makes a film accessible, is that we know how it works. We know that they're either going to all die or end up going into the sunset, and it's going to end one of those two ways, basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then my subsequent question is, do you think, because Jackson doesn't convert everything in the Lord of the Rings movies, and he does convert everything in the Hobbit movies, and the Hobbit movies were, firstly, much worse, but secondly, much less liked. And so do you think he actually wasn't, I would have argued that he wasn't brave enough with Return of the King. I think he should have made more changes. What do people, am I a heretic? Or, because that is one of the recurring criticisms I hear of that movie, is that it has 7 endings and you probably only need at maximum 3. What do people think?
I mean, the real ending of that, one of the most important lessons of that story is that, maybe you can save the world, but you're not saving the world for yourself. And the trauma of the returning soldier, and how you'll never fit into once you have that moral wound and you've been to war, you'll never fit into the society that you came to save. So, I mean, I think that needed to be shown in some way, shape, or form. And I think the multiple endings of that movie painted that fairly well, because not only was Frodo screwed up in PTSD, but Bilbo was as well. And we saw him at the end of things, also, a bearer of the ring, so I think I didn't have a problem with it. I would have preferred, actually, if they had also shown the Battle of the Shire, which was an ending that they cut out. And we would have seen, Sauron's end and that kind of thing, because, we never really got to see that in the film. But, spoilers, he was killed in the Shire by Wormtongue.
I think that you do make a good point about the Hobbit, and I think that the Hobbit films don't work for a lot of reasons. But I think largely because it departed, in my opinion, too far from the books. I think trying to mix in all of the information from the Second Age Silmarillion and appendices into the Hobbit, and then there was the mix, the very bizarre change in tone between those scenes, with the sort of like slapstick, crazy ridiculousness with the dwarves, and especially in the Misty Mountains and so forth, and all of that. It was very, was trying to capture the spirit of the Hobbit as originally written as a children's story, and the one that's quite humorous again, but then like getting in all of this stuff of like what Gandalf is doing off with Galadriel and the other wizards, and pulling all of that information from the appendices, and for me it just didn't work. The mix didn't work. I didn't like the sort of what seemed like it was a very contrived romance between the elf and the dwarf, and even if he was like a super handsome dwarf.
I mean, don't get me wrong, right? There are relationships that don't work on the page, that if you cast two actors with a lot of chemistry, you can get away with an awful lot. And that is, I guess one of the other strengths of movies is that like great actors with chemistry can elevate character interactions beyond what is on the page, which is probably fair.
And I think that's a really good point too, that actors, that having really, really, really excellent, fantastic actors can overcome a lot. So, and I remember Peter Jackson like raving about the actors that he had, and talking about how they managed to deal with what he called a difficult text. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, I love the films and how all of the actors sort of embraced the kind of highbrow language and did so well with it. Whereas in other films with other actors who, may not be as skilled, uttering that kind of dialogue just doesn't work out well. So
that makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to, I know that Dan and Rob, you've both had experience adapting from one form of these media to another. So Dan, I think you've had experience of adapting a screenplay into a novel, and Rob, you've gone in the other direction. And so I was wondering whether we should talk a little bit on how you found that experience, what you had to change as part of that conversion in light of kind of what we were talking about, but whether it gave you any other kind of insights into how the media differ. I'm going to start with Rob, and then I'll come to you afterwards, Dan. So like Rob, how did you find that process?
I found the process to be very interesting because of the things I had to unpack in turning it into a screenplay were kind of surprising, because it's all, the screen is all panoramic third person. It's all about what you see. If you don't see it, it's not there. So in a novel, you can have a character's thought, and you can't do that without, doing some kind of cheesy voiceover or something like that, which I didn't want to do. And, exposition becomes very different when you do it on screen as well, as opposed to when you do it in a novel. Because, when you're writing a novel, depending on your POV, the exposition can just be as part of the action. But, if you need to have people know a certain thing in a certain scene in a film, you've got to find a way to put it right there in front of them. Or remind them of something that happened, 15, 20 minutes ago, because they may have forgotten already because of the big battle scene that happened in between. So there's a lot of little unpacking that you need to do in each scene. Think about, all right, so how is this going to look to the eye? And then, you could do the thing where you let the director figure it out. But, I'd like to give them at least a little bit of a hand so they don't screw it up. And then, you start thinking about the special effects and how you want this to look. And, because you're putting so much of how things look into the screen directions, the stage directions or whatever, as opposed to the characters revealing the scene through the characters' interaction with it, that it's almost like you're compartmentalizing it to the nth degree, which I found both kind of fascinating and frustrating.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And the point about kind of having to remind the audience of things is a really interesting one as well. It kind of ties into what we were saying about being able to flip back in a book, but not being able to do that in a movie. So Dan, how was your experience going in the other direction? Like, how was it adapting a screenplay? Was everything Rob said but the opposite, or was it more nuanced than that?
I mean, it's interesting to hear that. My experience, it was a screenplay I'd written, so I knew it. I knew the story, I knew the characters. And one of the reasons I started writing screenplays in the first place was I thought my dialogue in my novels was rubbish. And obviously in the screenplay, a lot of the story is conveyed through dialogue, so you have to really be on top of it. So it's really for me it was fun. I'll say that first and foremost, it was fun. I don't particularly like writing the first draft of a novel, but I love editing it and playing with it. And with this, I had a screenplay, so I have action, I have dialogue, I have characters, I have plot, I have the beats all in relatively the right place. So I have it all there, and it was really fun to take it and sort of just pop it in the book and let it expand. So I've got my little chunks of action. So, the plane flies over the bay and it's being chased by rocket men in this one. And that's it. That's the action in the screenplay. You can't just dump that into the book because that's really dull and over very quickly. So you have to sort of pick that apart and pull out the interesting bits and expand them. And the dialogue, similarly, you can't just drop it in there and have it work, because you will have a very short book. So you have to pull that out, and then you start thinking, well, which bits of this could be internalized, because now you have all that to play with. So I loved it. I really loved it because I had everything in place, and now I just get to make it bigger and deeper and more epic. So I really enjoyed it.
Nice. No, and so that kind of ties into stuff we were discussing earlier, which is when you so we mentioned Cloud Atlas, and we mentioned It, and we mentioned a couple of other stories. I think, Rob, you mentioned Foundation, where the screenwriter clearly played with the structure of the underlying book in order to make more suitable for the screen. So how do you decide when to just sort of convert something more literally and kind of either put it in the book and expand it, or kind of in the case of a screenplay, just be like, oh, well, I can get this exposition across with the conversation between these two. And when do you decide to actually know this structure doesn't work and I need to change it? How do you, that must be a very difficult decision, I would have thought.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is like when you're writing a book or a short story, you don't want to leave your character alone too much in their own head, because then they start thinking, and then it's just page after page of like thinking and ruminating. But you can actually do some of that in a film if you've got a good actor. I mean, you think about Tom Hanks in Castaway. Eventually, he needed a volleyball to talk to. But for a while there, he was able to he was able to be alone on screen without any dialogue, and you could kind of still know what's going on. Or Lola Run, which is a German film, which she spends a lot of time literally on stage just running, or on screen just running into banging into things and that kind of stuff. So if you've got a good enough actor director, and the filming is right, you can make that work. That you can't. So anytime when I was adapting the short story that I turned into a screenplay, I had to find ways to kind of make that change, because it would work in one medium and wouldn't work in the other medium. It would only work for a short time in that other medium. But you also had to think about, for example, we were talking about the Lord of the Rings and that overarching idea of this is about war, this is about PTSD, this is about the soldier returning home. And, if you think about it, maybe there's a way to shortcut that in a film that you wouldn't have to put those four endings in. If you could find a way to make that more clear more quickly, which maybe you could have done. Maybe.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I will just say very quickly, so we've got about 15 minutes left in the slot. So if you are watching and you have questions, burning questions that you wish our glamorous panel to answer, then please do put them in the Q&A or in the YouTube chat, and our lovely Pam will convey the YouTube ones over to me. We do have a question from YouTube, which is, I think, really relevant to what we're currently discussing. So I'm gonna pose it to you, which is, we've talked a lot about adaptations that we thought worked, and we've talked a little bit about adaptations we didn't think worked. But are there adaptations where the book was bad but the movie was good? Can anyone think of examples in that genre, is the question? Or Amanda, straight with a hand up.
Oh God, I'm having a senior moment. Oh, phooey. And I raised my hand. If I were on Jeopardy, the buzzer would be going off, because Dan, what's his name?
Brown?
Yes, Dan Brown. The movie of Da
Vinci Code.
Da Vinci Code. Thank you. I thought the movie was superior to the book, because I really, frankly, hated the book. So, the movie was able to circumvent a lot of the problems that I had with the book, which for me came down to the Da Vinci Code being, highly derivative, poor man's version of Foucault's pendulum. So, yeah. Anyway, and so, but I enjoyed the movie. So that's one where I thought the movie was better. And I'll go back to Game of Thrones. Frankly, I know it's sort of heresy to say this, but I actually like the series better than the books, especially as the series went on, because I think that this is an example where I think George Martin, starts going off on too many different tangents and bringing in too many characters, and there's too many contenders for the Iron Throne in the books, and it's confusing, and you just don't. And I think that my theory, which is entirely mine, is that the reason why Martin hasn't actually been able to move the series forward from a writer's perspective is because he's got himself into this knot of like, how do I resolve this? How do I get rid of, half of these contenders, and that I myself have put on the continent and introduced, and what the heck, how do I get myself out of this problem? So I think that's why in my theory, which I have, what do I know? Nothing. But this is I think that the series was able to stick to to streamline the storytelling and conflate characters in a really compelling and interesting way that where everything stayed on point a lot better. And then unfortunately, probably because of budgetary factors, then they weren't given enough material at the very end to wrap it up in a way that made sense, so that everybody, the way that they did wrap it up, it happened too fast for most people, myself included. So it didn't work at the end, but in the early seasons, it really nicely mushed the story together in a way that I thought worked better than the books.
Fair enough.
Plus, all the heroes in the books were 12 and 13 at the beginning, and that was a little disturbing, or a lot disturbing. So I'm glad they aged them up.
Yes, they aged them up. They did the same thing in Wheel of Time. They made all the characters about 5 or 6 years older than they are at the beginning of the books, and I don't know that with the Wheel of Time adaptation that has really worked. My family and I are debating whether we want to continue and want to stick with it or not. So particularly my husband, who hasn't read the books, and he's like, I hate all of these people. Why do I want to stick with this?
Yeah, my problem with that series is Rand is far too clean all the time. He's always like perfectly dressed and beautiful when he should be a little scruffy, but that's just
Yes.
Rob and Dan, can you think of any examples of adaptations where the source material was kind of weak, but the ensuing result was good?
Well, I was just thinking, and I'm pretty sure it started as a book, but Jurassic Park.
Yes, it did.
I'm not going to say it was
That's a great
necessarily a
example.
bad book, but the movie is obviously spectacular. And I think because you can show all that, and it very much is a visual thrill ride, I think that works better than the book.
And it's not a bad book, but I was thinking about Arrival, and the short story that became Arrival is a great short story, but the things they could do with the visuals in that movie, like showing how the gravity change worked when they came into the ship, and they added the element of like the conflict with the Chinese or something like that that kind of created some urgency in that particular thing. I think that possibly made that better. Not that the original was bad, but I think the film actually breathed some life and some excitement into that.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film. I love that movie. Yeah. So, as far as I actually haven't read any of Michael Crichton's books, but my understanding is that he actually writes in a very cinematic way, and that his books are sort of read like movies. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, but
I used to love them for the same reason I really love Matthew Riley, is that because they are cinematic. But I think with something like Jurassic Park, seeing it just takes it to a whole nother level. I mean, I took my youngest to the 30th anniversary, I think, in 4DX, so the chairs move and it is amazing, and it was in 3D as well, and it looks pristine.
I bet it did. That's awesome.
So I was also going to ask. So we have a question in the chat, or a kind of a comment in the chat by Roman, who kind of basically asks what we think of The Expanse. And I was going to say, so The Expanse, the first book in the series, Leviathan Wakes, was released sort of after the first season of Game of Thrones started broadcasting. And given that the authors are kind of very closely connected to Martin, I assume that they had some knowledge of how the Game of Thrones TV show was going. And so what about books where it's clear that the authors have written them with the adaptation kind of in the back of their head? I'm thinking particularly of Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which was optioned for a movie, I think, before he wrote it. So how does that work? How do you write a book if you are writing a book specifically because you want it to be optioned? How does that affect your creative process? I guess is a question I would ask.
Do you want to add the ideas like a novelization? How does it change when you're writing a novelization of an established property? Because I'm thinking about, the Star Wars movie came out and then the novelization came out and added, so much to that particular story. That might be an interesting thing to talk about as well.
Yeah, no, I'm very, very open to that. I've read the novelization of a couple of the Star Wars movies and the Serenity movie, and they were, but yeah.
Oh, I'll jump in and answer your first question, mainly because I try and write cinematically because that's where I get a lot of my inspiration from. So these books are very much written with that cinematic experience in mind, but I don't think you should ever write anything to be sold to a certain publisher, to be optioned, to write for a certain, this topic is really hot right now, so I'm going to write a book about that. I think you need to write the story that needs to be written, if that makes sense. That doesn't make any sense.
No, I agree with you. And I also think that there's too much trend chasing that goes on in the industry anyway. And by the time something's a trend, if you're chasing it, it's too late. You need to write your own stuff. I've contributed to I've written a few option things, which are, that's probably the wrong term, but I've written for this outfit that basically compiles short story anthologies, which they then try to sell to producers in Hollywood, hoping that they will, pick up on one of the short stories and take off with it. And that the way that whole thing works is that the writers are given a prompt, and we're supposed to generate something between roughly 3,000 to 5,000 words on that prompt. And what amazes me is the huge variety of stuff that people come up with based on the prompt. And I've always been astounded by other people's creativity, because I'm afraid I'm kind of very literal, and I see the prompt and I see that it's got to have X, Y, and Z in it. And then I write a story around X, Y, and Z. But other people go way, way cooler places than I've been able to come up with. And it just amazes me how human beings, creative minds work, in those circumstances. And I think that, the next best thing is going to be something that no one has thought of, with the caveat that all stories have already been told in some form or another, and there is nothing original. So
I think
fit those two things together.
I think technically every play is contained in the digits of pi. So yeah, it's tricky. So thank you very much, all three of you, for your thoughts and insightful discussion. We're coming up on 8:30. So I'm going to ask you all for kind of a sort of short, pithy sign off, so that you can wow the audience with your verve and insight, and then they will go and buy all of your books. So yeah, I will start with Amanda, and then I'll go to Rob, and then I'll go to Dan. So Amanda, do you have any kind of summary that you want to or final thing you want to say to everyone?
No, it's you had to start with me, didn't you? Okay, setting the foundation for my co-panelists, I'll just say that I'm Amanda Justice. I write under AM Justice. I wish that I was able to capture with words the visuals that I imagine in my head. And that is sort of like one thing that I strive for as a writer in this, and I don't think I've climbed that mountaintop. So anyway, I've really enjoyed myself, and thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you. Rob?
Yep, I'm Rob Greene. I write as R.W.W. Greene. I've got a book coming out in October. It's purple, and the one before that is orange. And it's possible that they have a soundtrack. No,
you have to buy them to find out.
Yeah, buy them to find out. You may open the page and music may pour out, or it may not.
Love it. And then Dan, anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Well, I'm Dan Hanks, and I aspire to write cinematically. So I've got 2 books out at the moment, which probably scratch those itches of Indiana Jones-ish, The Mummy, and Ghostbusters-ish, with a bit of parenting thrown in. One thing I did want to finish, because we did sort of touch upon it, is that if you're an aspiring writer and you are sort of, struggling with novels or screenwriting, I just think you should try different mediums, because I grew as a writer through trying screenwriting and then coming back to novels. And then we haven't really touched upon it, but graphic novels, or we did touch upon it a little bit. And honestly, it's a really nice sweet spot right between the two, because you sort of get to direct it, you get the internalization, and you get to do cool things that are a nice mixture of both. So just go out there and write everything, try everything, and you'll be one of those people that we'll be talking about on the next panel.
That's excellent. So thank you to Amanda and Rob and Dan for coming and talking to us tonight. It's been wonderful. I've been very interested to talk to you all. And thank you to Pam Livingston for being the person behind the scenes who made it all go. I've put a link in the Zoom chat if you'd like to buy any Glasgow in 2024 merch. And we will have a fan table at Octocon, which is the 7th to the 8th of October at the Gibson Hotel in Dublin. And our next event is Lovecraftian Writers versus Lovecraft, which is on the 24th of October at the same time of 7 p.m. Keep an eye on our socials, which are in the YouTube description and in your Eventbrite email for lots of exciting announcements. And if you enjoyed this event, please consider volunteering for Glasgow 2024, because we're always looking for enthusiastic people, it says in my script. So yes, join us. Thank you very much again, everyone, and we will see you again next time.
Thanks, John.
Take care.
Bye.
And you're safe.